It began on a warm Saturday in July 2007. The sun hung low over Oak Hollow Drive, casting long shadows across trimmed lawns and parked minivans. The Wallace family had set up their garage sale by 8 a.m., filling the driveway with boxes of books, old electronics, and racks of worn clothing. Mark Wallace, a mechanic by trade, joked with neighbors as he haggled over socket sets and fishing gear. Julia Wallace, a stay-at-home mom, handled the kids' table, where board games and stuffed animals waited for new homes. Evan, their 6-year-old son, helped her organize them, while Lila, just 4, clutched a battered stuffed bunny and giggled as she skipped barefoot on the lawn. At the edge of the driveway sat a worn cardboard box with a hand-lettered sign that read, "Toys Free." By 4 p.m., the last of the foot traffic had left, and the heat had softened. The Wallace house was quiet again. By 6 p.m., the entire family was gone. No one saw them leave. No one heard a thing. They simply vanished. That evening, their neighbor Diane Madison walked over to return a lawn chair she had borrowed earlier that week. She knocked twice and waited. When no one answered, she tried again, then peeked through the living room window. The lights were on. The television flickered silently in the background. A pitcher of lemonade sat on the counter, condensation gathering around the base. It looked as if someone had stepped away for a moment, but there was no movement inside. Diane hesitated, then walked home slightly unsettled. By morning, after repeated unanswered calls from Julia's sister, police were called to perform a wellness check. What they found inside the house only deepened the mystery. Mark's keys were still on the entryway table. Julia's purse was untouched on the kitchen chair. Evan's baseball glove and Lila's sandals were by the front door. The laundry was half folded on the couch. Dinner ingredients sat prepped on the counter, but unused. Everything appeared paused mid-moment. Everything but the family. The minivan was still parked in the driveway. The backyard gate was closed. No signs of forced entry or struggle could be found. Julia's cell phone remained on the charger. Mark's wallet was untouched in the bedroom drawer. Investigators searched the property thoroughly. They brought in cadaver dogs and scoured the woods behind the neighborhood. Helicopters circled above. Teams of volunteers joined the effort. Flyers went up across the county. Highway billboards displayed the family's photos within 72 hours. Julia's wide smile, Mark's rugged, quiet expression, Evan's freckles and gap-toothed grin, Lila's curious brown eyes beneath a fringe of curls. They became familiar faces in every grocery store window and gas station bulletin board. But no answers came. The trail ended the moment the last item was sold at the garage sale. No security cameras had captured any useful footage. There were no suspicious vehicles reported, no sounds of shouting, nothing stolen. Only the box of free toys was unaccounted for. Neighbors offered theories. One woman claimed she saw a man in a rust-colored truck parked down the block that afternoon. She remembered thinking he looked out of place, maybe a little too interested in the children's table, but she dismissed it at the time. Another neighbor mentioned hearing what she thought was shouting around sunset, but when she stepped outside, the street was calm. Someone else recalled seeing Julia in a tense conversation with an unfamiliar man near the mailbox. But nothing came of it. Each tip faded into the next, leaving investigators with more questions than answers. The Wallace disappearance stunned the small Michigan town. It shook parents who now held their children's hands tighter and locked their doors at night. News crews camped on Oak Hollow Drive for days. Reporters filmed empty swings and quiet sidewalks, searching for poetic angles in a case that felt more like a dream interrupted than a crime. And still the Wallace home stood untouched, frozen in time. As months passed and seasons changed, hope waned. The investigation slowed. Detectives rotated off the case. The house was eventually sold at a quiet auction, its contents boxed and stored. New owners moved in. The Wallace name faded into memory. Some locals believed the family had fled on purpose. Others whispered of debt or secrets or betrayal. But the truth remained elusive. No bodies, no confirmed sightings, no closure. Just a perfect suburban family who disappeared without warning or trace. 16 years later, the story had become a ghost among the living, mentioned briefly at cookouts, passed down in cautionary tales to new residents. Most had moved on, until one day a woman from across the state bought an old plush toy at a church thrift sale. It was soft and faded, with the name Lila stitched faintly into its back. That night when her dog chewed through the seams, something fell out. Something no one expected. Dried. Reddish-brown. Human. Everything changed in that moment. The toy did not stand out at first. It sat among a pile of old stuffed animals on a folding table outside St. Luke's Community Church in Traverse City. Claire Benton, a retired schoolteacher, visited the church sale that morning, looking for picture frames and used books. She almost passed over the faded bear with one button eye and matted fur. It looked handmade and worn, but something about the stitching on its back caught her eye. The name Lila was sewn in uneven red thread. Claire could not remember why the name felt familiar until hours later when she sat watching television and a brief anniversary segment flashed across the screen. It featured photos of the Wallace family. Claire froze. The little girl in the photo wore the exact same bear in her arms. Claire blinked. She retrieved the toy from the bag and turned it over. Lila Wallace had been 4 years old when she vanished. Claire stared at the bear for a long time. That evening, her golden retriever ripped through the toy's back seam. A small crusted bundle dropped to the floor. Claire picked it up. It was hard and brittle. The smell hit her first, then the color. Panicked, Claire placed the remains into a plastic sandwich bag and drove it to the nearest police station. The officer on duty listened carefully as Claire explained everything. The bear the church sale, the strange name, and the crumbly object inside. He took the bag, promised to pass it along to the right department, and told Claire to wait for follow-up. 2 days later, she received a call from Detective Ron Vickers, an investigator with the Michigan State Police who had recently reopened several unsolved cases. Vickers had never worked the Wallace case before, but he knew its details by heart. When the DNA results came back, he immediately contacted Claire again. The substance had tested positive for human blood. It matched the DNA profile of Lila Wallace previously stored in the National Missing Persons database. Vickers was stunned. 16 years without a single credible lead, and now this. A child's toy donated to a church in a town over 100 miles from where the Wallaces were last seen. Detective Vickers drove to Traverse City the next morning. He met with the church's pastor, a mild-mannered man named Harold Tennyson, who explained that the donation had come in anonymously. Dozens of boxes had arrived the week prior. No paperwork, no receipts. Just a stack of labeled bins and bags left on the back steps of the church office. Vickers asked for security footage, but the cameras only captured the delivery after the fact. 2 teenage volunteers found the boxes stacked neatly at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday. They remembered nothing unusual. Vickers then examined every other toy from the same batch, but none contained anything suspicious. He sent them to the lab anyway. Over the following weeks, he scoured thrift stores and church basements in nearby counties, searching for anything bearing the same handmade stitching or tag. One store manager in Grand Rapids remembered seeing the same kind of bear 2 years earlier, but it had sold quickly. No record existed of the buyer. That trail went cold. Still, the appearance of the toy forced Vickers to re-examine the case from a new angle. He returned to the original reports. He re-interviewed the old neighbors. Many had since moved or passed away, but a few still remained on Oak Hollow Drive. Diane Madison, the neighbor who first called police back in 2007, recalled something new. She remembered seeing someone walk off with a toy box that afternoon just before dinner. It was not someone she recognized. A man with dark glasses and a limp. She had assumed he was a friend or a relative helping out. The detail had seemed unimportant at the time. Another neighbor, Alan Brewer, vaguely remembered a rust-colored pickup parked halfway down the street that same afternoon. He remembered it because it partially blocked his mailbox. The truck was gone within 10 minutes. Neither of these recollections had been reported originally. Vickers pulled traffic records hoping to find a match for the vehicle. Hours of searching revealed one ticket issued near the Wallace home the week before they vanished. The truck had been cited for parking in a red zone. It belonged to a man named Howard Lormer. Howard Lormer had no criminal record. He had never been interviewed in connection with the case. At the time, he lived 60 miles away in Lansing. Vickers visited the address listed on the 2007 ticket. A new family lived there. They had no idea who Howard was. The property records showed it had changed hands in 2008. Vickers tracked the title transfers and discovered that Lormer had sold the house and relocated to Indiana. He now lived in a rural county near the state line. Vickers drove down to speak with him. Howard was 68, frail, and used a cane. He denied any knowledge of the Wallace family. He said he had visited a friend in Oak Hollow once years ago, but could not recall the date. He said he never took any toys. He had no children. Nothing about the encounter confirmed guilt, but something about the man's evasive answers unsettled Vickers. He filed the interaction and requested a warrant to search Lormer's property. The Wallace case file had gathered dust for over a decade. Dozens of detectives had come and gone. The original lead investigator retired in 2014. Others were reassigned or burned out after too many dead ends. Tips would still trickle in from time to time, usually vague sightings or false confessions. Each was investigated, documented, and then dismissed. But now Detective Vickers had something new. Not just a piece of physical evidence, but a name. Howard Lormer. He was not in the original files. He had no known relationship to the Wallace family, no record of visiting the town before or after the disappearance. And yet his truck had been parked on the same street that day. He admitted to being there. He gave no convincing reason why. And now a toy that matched the ones given away at that garage sale had resurfaced with Lila's blood inside it. Vickers requested a search warrant for Lormer's Indiana property, but without stronger probable cause, the judge declined. Vickers needed more. He decided to dig deeper into Lormer's past. He drove to Lansing and began tracing every address, every job, and every contact listed on Lormer's history, going back to the late 90s. Vickers visited an old tire shop in Lansing where Lormer had worked part-time until 2006. The owner still remembered him, said he was quiet, punctual, and kept to himself. He lived in a small rental trailer on the outskirts of town. That same trailer had been sold shortly after the Wallace disappearance. Records showed Lormer had cashed out and moved within weeks of the event. Vickers obtained permission to access records from the mobile home park where Lormer once lived. The current resident allowed Vickers inside. It had been renovated several times, but in the crawl space beneath the unit, he discovered a locked metal box. The property owner granted access and allowed it to be pried open. Inside were dozens of photographs. Most were faded and unremarkable. Landscapes, roads, storefronts. But several were different. A photo showed Julia Wallace standing in her yard. Another captured Evan playing with his bike. These were taken before the day they vanished. There were no names written on the back, but the locations were unmistakable. A receipt folded between the photos showed a purchase of toy stuffing and buttons dated July 2007. Shaken Vickers returned to Michigan with the photos. He consulted the original case files and found that the Wallace family had indeed reported feeling watched in the weeks before their disappearance. Julia had mentioned to her sister that someone might have been outside their window late one night, but the report was never followed up. At the time, it had seemed like paranoia during a stressful summer. Now those words took on new meaning. Vickers brought the photos to the state forensic lab. The prints were analyzed for fingerprints and trace DNA. Meanwhile, he contacted a retired detective who had worked the Wallace case in its first year. That man, Dennis McHale, remembered how frustrating it had been. No break-ins, no witnesses. He always believed someone had taken them deliberately and knew exactly what they were doing. Vickers shared the Lormer photos. McHale said he had never seen them before. If Lormer had stalked the family beforehand, it meant this was not random. It meant he had prepared for it. Vickers asked McHale if anyone in the department had known Lormer. The name did not ring a bell. But someone else had raised alarms back then. There had been a call made to an anonymous tip line 3 days after the Wallace family vanished. The caller refused to give their name, but said the family was not far. The call was traced to a payphone outside a gas station in Grand Rapids. No cameras had been working at the time. The call had been dismissed when no evidence was found nearby. Vickers decided to pull that recording. He listened closely to the voice. It was gravelly low and male. He played the recording for Claire Benton, who had met Lormer briefly. She said it might be him, but she could not be certain. Forensic audio experts tried to match the voice with a recent sample Vickers obtained from Lormer's DMV records. The results were inconclusive, but suggested similar vocal patterns. Vickers still lacked enough to arrest him, but the pattern of circumstantial evidence was growing. He began contacting families from nearby counties who had reported similar unsettling events between 2006 and 2008. Several mentioned seeing a rust-colored truck. One even filed a report about a man offering free toys at a summer fair. The report was never followed up. That man was never identified. Back at headquarters, the fingerprint analysis came back. One partial print on the corner of a photograph matched Lormer's DMV record. It confirmed he had handled the photo. It still was not enough for an arrest, but it validated Vickers' suspicion. He compiled a full report and presented it to the state's attorney. They agreed it was time to bring Lormer in for formal questioning. The interview took place in Indiana with local authorities present. Lormer remained calm. He denied everything. He said he took photos as a hobby. He claimed he had no idea who the Wallaces were. When shown the images, he said he must have taken them during a vacation and never developed the film until later. He had no explanation for the receipt showing toy supplies. He became agitated when asked about the stuffed bear. The interview ended with no confession. But Vickers knew. He did not have the words yet, but the story was there, buried behind excuses and old photographs. Somewhere inside Howard Lormer was a secret that had stayed buried for 16 years. Detective Vickers found himself checking local online forums one night, scrolling through garage sale threads and second-hand listing sites. He had begun to believe that someone else out there might have unknowingly handled pieces of the Wallace case without realizing it. That theory proved correct when a quiet post on a hobbyist forum caught his eye. It was from a retired antique dealer named Simon Drell from Saginaw, who claimed to have auctioned off a vintage toy trunk labeled Garage Toys back in 2021. The post was old, but the phrase Garage Toys felt too specific to ignore. Vickers contacted Simon the next morning. The man was surprised, but willing to speak. Simon remembered the trunk clearly. He said it had been well preserved and filled with handcrafted stuffed animals and old board games. He mentioned one bear that seemed oddly detailed and had the name Lila faintly stitched inside. The trunk had been part of a lot sold by a private seller who requested anonymity. That detail troubled Vickers. He asked Simon to recall anything about the seller. Simon said the man had a noticeable limp and drove a faded red truck. That matched the original neighbor reports from Oak Hollow Drive. Simon dug into his old auction receipts and was able to provide a copy of the lot record. It listed the trunk as belonging to a donor using the initials HL. There was no full name, but the contact number listed had an Indiana area code. Vickers cross-referenced it with known numbers for Howard Lormer. It was not a direct match, but phone companies confirmed it had once been registered under the same address Lormer used when he first moved to Indiana in 2008. That was enough for Vickers to request renewed consideration for a warrant. He submitted the auction detail, the matching handwriting on the toy trunk label, and the partial print from the photo. The judge agreed there was now probable cause. The warrant was granted. Vickers organized a coordinated search of Lormer's Indiana property. Local deputies joined in, along with 2 forensic investigators from Michigan. The home was a single-level ranch on 5 acres surrounded by woods and overgrown fencing. Inside the layout was simple. A living room stacked with old papers, a kitchen with dust-covered appliances, 1 bedroom, 1 locked shed in the back. The shed door required bolt cutters. Inside were boxes, tools, broken electronics, and several covered storage containers. Vickers opened one and found an assortment of stuffed toys. Some were vintage, others looked handmade. The team documented everything. Another container held dozens of photographs, most damaged by moisture, but still recognizable. Some showed children in suburban yards. Others showed wooded areas, picnic tables, and family vehicles. All were dated between 2004 and 2008. Vickers brought the evidence back to Michigan. Analysis began immediately. The photos were compared with missing persons cases across multiple counties. Some matched unsolved disappearances. None had ever been connected before. In the meantime, a forensic technician examining the toys found something disturbing. One of the bears had stitching nearly identical to the one Claire Benton had turned in. The fabric was different, but the threading pattern and thread color were the same. Inside that bear they found human hair. DNA testing confirmed it belonged to Julia Wallace. It was the first physical confirmation she had not only been taken, but had been held for some time before her death. The revelation was devastating. Vickers sat alone in the evidence lab that evening, listening to the silence while flipping through the newly processed photos. One image stood out. It showed Julia Wallace in what looked like a basement. Her hands were not visible. She appeared to be staring toward someone just outside the frame. Behind her on the wall was a calendar showing August 2007. Vickers enlarged the photo. The edges were blurry. He sent it to digital analysis, hoping for a clearer background read. The file was placed under restricted access due to its graphic nature. That image changed the focus of the case entirely. This was no longer just a missing persons file. This was confirmation of captivity, possibly torture, and likely premeditated murder. They could not yet prove Lormer had taken the photo, but the timing, location, and materials all pointed to him. He was brought in again for questioning. This time his public defender advised silence. Lormer spoke only once during the interview. He said the photographs were old travel shots he had collected from antique markets. He said the toy trunk had been gifted to him years ago by someone he no longer remembered. He denied everything else. Without a confession, Vickers focused on building a case through physical evidence. He had the bear containing Julia's hair. He had the old toy trunk sold under initials that matched Lormer. He had the auctioneer's statement and the shed filled with items directly tying to missing persons. He was still waiting on lab results from more items. In the meantime, the forensic team ran deeper checks on the fabric used in the bear. It was traced to a supplier that had once operated in Michigan, but closed in 2008. Purchase orders showed one customer had ordered that specific cloth type in 2007. The order was signed under the name Howard Lormer. That finally sealed it. The chain of evidence now showed procurement of materials possession, of items linked to victims, and distribution of objects containing human DNA. A grand jury reviewed the file and approved an indictment for unlawful imprisonment, destruction of evidence, and suspected homicide. It would take weeks before trial preparations could begin. But one thing was certain now. Someone had kept trophies, and someone had decided to give them away. The DNA lab at the State Forensic Center worked under heavy pressure. The Wallace case had drawn new attention since the discovery of Julia's hair inside one of the recovered toys. Every item retrieved from Lormer's property was bagged, labeled, and logged with care. Analysts worked in shifts examining fibers, hairs, and microscopic debris embedded in the seams of the bears and the lining of the trunk. Vickers checked in with the lab daily, often pacing the hallway outside the secure testing wing. On the fourth day, the lead technician called him in. He presented a sealed envelope, and inside was a report that confirmed new DNA findings. It was a partial profile, degraded, but readable. The sample came from a scrap of fabric stuffed inside the body of one of the smaller bears. The match came back as Evan Wallace. The boy had been missing since 2007, with no trace until now. Vickers sat down and stared at the report. The item that carried Evan's DNA was not a tag or a label. It was a piece of a striped shirt, shredded and used as padding, the same shirt Evan wore the day of the garage sale, according to family photos. Vickers asked for confirmation. The analyst nodded and pointed to the testing notes. The red dye matched the pigment from Evan's shirt. Microscopic analysis showed stitching patterns from children's clothing brands sold in that era. The conclusion was that someone had cut up Evan's shirt and used it to stuff the toy. The implications were brutal. Someone had deliberately chosen to turn the child's clothing into filler for a stuffed animal. It was not accidental. It was planned. Vickers walked the hallway of the lab again, trying to steady his thoughts. He returned to the evidence storage room and reviewed each item catalogued from Lormer's shed. One box contained receipts. Most were faded beyond legibility, but two stood out. One showed a bulk purchase of toy buttons and synthetic thread. The other listed 2 large canvas bags from a fabric store near Lansing. The date was July 12, 2007. That was 2 weeks before the Wallace family vanished. Vickers felt the weight of the case pressing down harder. He began to believe that the toys were not just trophies. They were messages. Carefully constructed signs of ownership. Of control. He returned to Lormer's property with a smaller team and a search warrant focused on digital media. This time they brought a data recovery technician to examine old computers and storage devices. They found one desktop unit in the bedroom, outdated and corroded, but potentially salvageable. It was taken back to the tech lab and carefully dismantled. Days passed as the team extracted fragments from the hard drive. Slowly they recovered partial image files, video clips, and logs. Most were corrupted. Some were clearly unrelated. But buried among them were files labeled with dates from July and August 2007. One folder contained a series of low-resolution videos labeled with the initials JW and coded dates. The footage was grainy and hard to watch. One clip showed what appeared to be Julia Wallace in a dimly lit space. Her voice was inaudible, but her expression was clear. She looked terrified. Another video captured faint audio of a man speaking. The words were unclear, but his voice pattern was similar to Lormer's known vocal print. These videos were immediately secured and submitted for forensic enhancement. While experts worked on enhancing the footage, Vickers expanded the investigation. He contacted child protection units in counties where Lormer had previously lived. He asked for old reports involving suspicious behavior, even those dismissed or unsubstantiated. In Muskegon, a social worker had filed a note in 2005 about a reclusive man who offered toys to children outside a laundromat. The man had not broken any laws. No charges were filed. The name listed was Howard Lormer. Vickers requested the original report and photos attached. The man described in the report had a limp and carried small plush toys in a duffel bag. When asked to leave, he complied without resistance. The pattern was becoming clearer. Lormer had moved from county to county, operating under the radar, using toys to lure or track families. He had studied them, followed them, chosen them. For the Wallace family, the toy box was not just a casual garage item, it was a calculated trap. The bear containing Julia's DNA had been carefully preserved. The one with Evan's shirt fragment had been folded deep in the trunk. Lormer had distributed parts of his crime into the world like seeds, knowing someday they might be found. The forensic lab finished enhancement on one of the video files. It was short, under 20 seconds, but damning. Julia Wallace's voice could now be heard whispering something over and over. It sounded like a plea or a name. The final frame showed a glimpse of the room's wall. Analysts identified the cinder blocks as common to commercial storage units built during the 1990s. That gave Vickers a new lead. He pulled property records on storage facilities owned or rented by Lormer or his aliases. One address located 20 minutes from Lormer's old residence in Lansing had been abandoned and never released. The unit had not been opened in years. With a court order, Vickers entered the facility alongside crime scene technicians. The air was musty and stagnant. Inside the unit was a mattress, a folding chair, and children's drawings pinned to the wall with rusted thumbtacks. One drawing depicted 4 stick figures inside a square. Another showed a figure lying down with a red line across it. It was crude, but unmistakably created by a child. They recovered all items for analysis and flagged the unit as a potential primary holding site. That space told a story no one wanted to imagine. The discovery of the drawings pinned to the wall inside the storage unit disturbed every member of the investigation team. The sketches were crude and uneven, drawn with colored pencils on yellowing notebook paper, but they spoke volumes. One featured a tall figure looming beside a group of smaller ones, while another showed a stick child inside a box with no windows. A third drawing had a rough map shape with X marks and arrows possibly referencing locations or movements. Vickers stood in that stale, dust-filled space and tried to imagine the fear of the children who had once been inside. Crime scene technicians took hundreds of photos and removed every object for analysis. Behind one of the wooden panels covering the back wall, they uncovered a small cutout leading to a cinder block cavity. It was no wider than an air duct, but large enough for a child to crawl through. Inside the cavity was an old blanket faded with use. Fibers on the blanket later tested positive for Lila Wallace's DNA. The evidence now showed that the children had been kept in separate spaces, one small room for isolation, another for display, and the rest of the unit as some kind of twisted workshop. The forensic team conducted a full scan of the storage unit, both above ground and beneath. Their equipment detected hollow space beneath the far corner of the unit's concrete flooring. With permission from the property owner, they broke through the surface. What they uncovered next changed everything. Underneath the unit was a narrow staircase that led to a previously undocumented underground room. It was built from poured cement, reinforced with metal supports. The ceiling was low, the air stale and laced with mildew. This room had been purposefully constructed. A single rusted cot sat against the wall, along with a folding table and plastic bins. One of the bins contained clothing, children's clothing, folded neatly. Some still had price tags. Others were stained and frayed. Another bin held notebooks. Each page contained writing, careful notes about movements, behaviors, and physical traits. Each entry was dated, most aligned with the days immediately following the Wallace family's disappearance. One entry read, "The older boy asks too many questions. He needs more quiet time." Another read, "The girl likes the blue bear. That one works best." The handwriting matched samples known to belong to Lormer. This room was not a panic space or a shelter. It was a controlled environment, designed for someone with dark intentions. The investigators reviewed every notebook page. Each detail revealed new horrors. There were references to feeding times, noise levels, sleep patterns, descriptions of fear responses. It became clear this was not a moment of madness, but the actions of someone methodical. Someone who observed suffering with detachment. Vickers believed Lormer had been experimenting with control, breaking down each family member in different ways. The descriptions of Julia's behavior were especially disturbing. She had tried to protect her children. She refused food until they were fed. She resisted. Her entry on August 8th read, "She still stares like she expects help. That look needs to go." The entry stopped there. That was the last record mentioning her. Another notebook entry 3 days later mentioned moving weight to the pit. That prompted a new scan of the underground room's floor. Cadaver dogs were brought in. In the far corner near the cot, they alerted twice. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed soft soil beneath the concrete. Excavation began. They uncovered fragmented human remains. Later, forensic specialists confirmed they belonged to Julia Wallace. Her remains had been buried in the same space where she was last seen alive in the footage. Meanwhile, another discovery made at the unit added a disturbing layer. Hidden behind a false wall panel was a locked cabinet. Inside it were dozens of VHS tapes and digital mini-cassettes, each labeled with codes and numbers. They were sent to a media lab for conversion and analysis. The first few showed poor quality footage of public spaces, parks, schools, shopping plazas. The focus often lingered on families with small children. Some footage had dates going back to 2003. One clip lasted only 5 minutes and showed Julia Wallace again this time, with Lila asleep on her lap. The camera was positioned high, possibly mounted, and the audio captured her humming softly. Vickers could barely listen. He stopped the playback and requested full documentation before moving forward. This was no longer just evidence. It was a catalog of control. The team sorted through every video, flagging any that featured identifiable individuals. One clip showed Evan banging on a wall, clearly mouthing something, possibly the word help. These were not just recordings. They were trophies, preserved memories of domination. They would never be shown publicly, but they would help convict the man responsible for orchestrating every second. Vickers compiled all the new evidence and submitted it to the district attorney. With Julia's remains now recovered, the charges were upgraded to homicide. A new warrant was issued for Lormer's arrest. He was taken into custody without incident. This time he was held without bail. The trial would be long, but Vickers felt confident they had built a case that would hold. One that would finally explain what happened in July 2007. Every piece of clothing, every handwritten page, and every haunting video helped reconstruct a timeline that had been hidden for 16 years. The underground room was sealed and labeled a primary crime scene. The property owner agreed to demolish the entire unit complex, citing the community's need to heal. Residents gathered the day it came down. Some held candles, others prayed. Most stood in silence. The Wallace family had never left the state. They had never run away. They had been imprisoned beneath everyday life, unseen, unheard, until one stuffed toy opened the door to their truth. The deeper the investigation reached, the more vivid the Wallace family's final days became. Each notebook recovered from the underground room included time logs and detailed accounts of routine tasks. Vickers read them late into the night, the cold weight of each word pressing heavier with every page. One entry noted a change in behavior. It said, "The boy is no longer speaking. He only watches." That entry was dated August 12th. 4 days later, another line read, "The girl cries less now. She is easier to move." These notes were not written by someone reacting to guilt. They were observations of control and detachment. The evidence painted a grim picture. Julia had been held in the main room. The children were separated, possibly rotated between compartments. Vickers began to piece together the purpose of the different areas. One space for observation, one for restraint, one likely for recording. There were no details describing how Julia died, but the burial entry and her DNA under the cot told enough. Her resistance likely led to punishment. The final note referencing her was brief. It read, "No longer useful." That line stayed with Vickers for days. He could not sleep. He could not forget it. Meanwhile, the forensic team continued examining the drawings found in the room. Several appeared to have been done by Evan. His writing was more advanced. One sketch showed a figure next to a square, labeled cold. Another had small arrows leading away from stick figures. It looked like a map. Investigators scanned and enlarged the image. They compared it to known layouts of the storage facility and realized the arrows pointed toward the rear of the unit. That corner had already been cleared, but the drawing indicated something hidden. Vickers returned to the site with a small team and used ground radar to scan again. Beneath the rear wall, a shallow compartment had been carved out of the foundation. It had been covered with scrap metal and sealed with tar. When they opened it, they found a small duffel bag. Inside were personal items: a child's sneaker, a red baseball cap, a bracelet made of beads. Each item was photographed and bagged. The baseball cap matched one Evan wore in the last known photo taken at the garage sale. The bead bracelet belonged to Lila. That section had served as a hidden storage vault, possibly for items Lormer considered valuable. While the contents were being cataloged, a forensic artist reconstructed a timeline of the drawings based on paper age and pencil wear. The earliest ones showed outdoor scenes, sun and trees. Later images grew darker, more shadows, stick figures with tears or arms crossed. The final drawing attributed to Lila by handwriting size and shape was a picture of a small heart with two smaller ones beside it. Above them in shaky letters she had written Mom and stars. Vickers took that paper and kept it in his office. It was the last known trace of the little girl who once danced barefoot at a garage sale. Lila's body had still not been found, but evidence showed she had lived in the underground room for at least 6 weeks. Entries described her sleep patterns and her fear of loud noises. One video clip showed her curled up on a mattress, rocking slowly. Her hands covered her ears. The man filming her had spoken softly, describing the toy he held. It was the same blue bear later found at the church sale. That video ended before she looked up. It was unclear how long she remained in that place after Julia was buried. Lormer remained silent in custody. His attorney filed motions to exclude the video evidence, claiming the media had been obtained in violation of privacy. The court denied the motion. Another motion argued the notebooks were not verified as his writing. Forensic experts confirmed the handwriting matched samples from his job applications and earlier DMV documents. Still, no one could place him at the Wallace home that day in 2007. The surveillance footage was missing. No one had taken a clear photo of him on Oak Hollow Drive. But the puzzle was almost complete. The receipts, the clothing, the toys, the handwriting, the footage, the underground room. It all pointed to one person. Lormer had no accomplices. Every step was taken alone. That fact disturbed Vickers more than anything. Not only had this man created a system to hold and monitor a family, he had done it with such precision that it lasted unnoticed for years. A single toy had undone him. But the trail of suffering behind it ran deeper than any one moment could explain. The Wallace family had lived in a world no one else saw, hidden behind walls, and toys and silence. For the first time in the case, Vickers allowed himself to feel the weight of loss. He reviewed the photos of the family again. Julia in her garden. Mark helping Evan with a bike. Lila blowing bubbles on the front porch. Each image now held contrast with the ones recovered from the storage unit. The joy before the fall. The light before the shadow. Vickers stared longest at one photo. It showed the entire family during a backyard picnic. Julia sat cross-legged in the grass, smiling. Mark held a paper plate. Evan leaned against his mother, and Lila held the blue bear. The same bear that would one day resurface in a church sale stained with the blood of a child. Vickers printed that image and kept it beside Lila's heart drawing. He knew the case would go to trial soon. He knew the defense would fight every piece of evidence. But he also knew the story had finally been revealed. Every entry, every sketch, every object told a part of it. Together, they told the full truth of what had happened to a family that vanished during a garage sale in 2007. The courtroom was silent as the prosecution began their case. Howard Lormer sat expressionless at the defense table, wearing a wrinkled beige shirt and loosely fitting trousers. His white hair had grown out during his time in holding. He looked older than his 68 years. Around him, reporters filled the gallery, notebooks in hand, cameras waiting outside. Family members of other missing children watched from the benches, silent and tense. The Wallace case had become a symbol, a thread connecting pain across communities. The prosecution opened with the timeline. They laid out the events beginning with the garage sale in July 2007. They described the sudden disappearance, the abandoned meal on the counter, and the untouched front door. Then they introduced the toy. The blue bear found by Claire Benton. It had started everything. From there, the evidence unfolded piece by piece. The matching DNA. The stuffed animals containing human remains. The drawings and notebooks found in the underground room. The prosecution called the evidence a narrative, not just items, but a sequence, a pattern of behavior that removed any doubt. They said the case was not just about a missing family. It was about a man who hid cruelty beneath normality. Claire Benton took the stand on the third day. She described finding the bear at the church sale. Her voice shook as she recalled the moment her dog tore the toy open and blood flaked onto the floor. She said she felt something was wrong the moment she saw the stitched name. Lila. The prosecutor asked her to describe her actions step by step. Claire told the court how she had placed the stained item into a sandwich bag and driven it to the police station. She said she never imagined it would unlock a case that had gone cold for 16 years. The defense cross-examined gently. They asked if she could confirm the toy had not been contaminated. Claire admitted she had not worn gloves, but forensic testing had already confirmed the presence of human blood. The DNA matched Lila Wallace. The defense had little room to argue. They moved quickly. When the auctioneer testified next, he brought with him the original sales record from the trunk full of toys. He pointed to the initials HL, the same ones belonging to Howard Lormer. He confirmed the man had delivered the trunk and appeared to favor anonymity. The prosecutors then presented the notebooks. Each page was projected on a screen. The room darkened. A forensic handwriting expert walked the jury through the comparisons. He showed how the writing in the notebooks matched known samples from Lormer's DMV documents, employment records, and a signed lease. He explained the slant of the letters, the pressure on the strokes, and the habit of capitalizing certain words. The jury watched silently. Then came the photos. The Wallace family captured before their disappearance. Julia standing by her mailbox, Evan with his bike, Lila at the garden's edge. These photos had been taken without the family's knowledge, found hidden in a box beneath Lormer's trailer years after he left Lansing. Each image was time-stamped within days of their disappearance. The defense did not deny the photographs were in his possession. They claimed he had found them at a flea market. The jury looked unconvinced. When asked why someone would buy candid photographs of strangers, the defense had no reply. The prosecution used that silence as emphasis. They said silence had defined Lormer from the beginning. Quiet entrances, quiet exits, quiet violence. It was how he had operated for decades. Next came the most emotional day of testimony. Forensic investigators described the underground room beneath the storage unit. They showed diagrams and photographs. They outlined the objects found: a cot, bins of clothing, notebooks, handmade toys. Then they played a short video. It showed Julia Wallace sitting on the edge of a cot, rocking slightly. Her hands were folded in her lap. She looked thin, her eyes sunken. She did not speak. The clip lasted only 15 seconds. The prosecution played it only once. Members of the gallery turned away. The defense objected, but the judge overruled. It was the only video the jury would see. Others were described in closed session. One described a faint voice crying behind a wall. Another showed a child drawing alone in silence. These details were summarized in court documents, but not shown publicly. The prosecution emphasized that these were not just recordings. They were tools used to document suffering. The jury was visibly shaken. Several wiped away tears. The judge called for a recess. In the hallway, Vickers stood with arms folded, watching as reporters whispered into their phones. He had prepared for years to see this case reach a courtroom. Now every minute carried the weight of lives lost. Later that week, the prosecution revealed the final piece of evidence. It was Julia Wallace's remains recovered beneath the floor. A forensic anthropologist explained how the burial site matched the entries in Lormer's notebook. She showed how decomposition patterns aligned with the date listed in the entry, labeled "weight moved to pit." The prosecution reminded the jury that Lormer had never reported the body, never alerted authorities, never showed any indication that what happened had been accidental. They called it calculated, planned, a gradual process of isolation and control. The defense offered no alternative theory. They only asked the jury to consider whether doubt still remained. The burden of proof. Reasonable doubt. But the jury had already heard enough. The final image presented was the drawing made by Lila. A heart, 2 stars, and the word "Mom" written in wobbly letters. It had been the last thing she ever created. The courtroom sat in silence, not because of legal strategy, but because of what had been taken from that child. No verdict had yet been read. But in the eyes of the room, the truth had already been spoken. The courtroom filled quickly on the morning the verdict was to be read. Reporters arrived before dawn, lining the front steps with their equipment, broadcasting the scene to audiences across the country. Parents who had lost children to unresolved cases sat quietly, their faces marked by time and sorrow. Vickers stood at the back near the door, arms crossed, watching the seats fill. He had been warned not to expect catharsis, that cases like this never truly closed, but he also knew that justice could take many forms. The jury had deliberated for only 5 hours. Their decision, they said, had been clear. The judge entered and called the court to order. Everyone stood. The foreperson handed a slip of paper to the bailiff, who passed it forward. The judge read the verdict aloud. On the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Julia Wallace, guilty. On the charge of unlawful imprisonment, guilty. On the charge of child endangerment, guilty. On every count, the jury had agreed. Howard Lormer showed no reaction. He sat still, eyes forward, hands folded. The silence in the room deepened as each word fell. There was no applause, only the sound of quiet breathing and shuffling feet. Vickers remained in his position at the back, eyes fixed on the table where Lormer sat. The man who had orchestrated so much pain now faced life without parole. The court clerk finished reading the sentence. Life in prison without the possibility of release. The judge made brief closing remarks thanking the jury for their service. He acknowledged the weight of the evidence and the dignity shown throughout the proceedings. Then, one by one, the jury members filed out, some with tears in their eyes. Claire Benton, who had first discovered the bear, sat motionless near the front, a tissue in her hand. She had never asked to become part of this story, but she had never looked away from it either. Reporters rushed to catch reactions outside, but most attendees walked quietly to their cars. There were no victory speeches, no moments of celebration, only a kind of stillness, a recognition that something had ended, but something else would always remain. Vickers stepped into the hallway and took a long breath. He had followed a single thread, one discarded toy, and uncovered a story buried under years of silence. He had seen justice handed down, and he had seen its cost. In the weeks that followed, efforts began to memorialize the Wallace family. Community leaders in the neighborhood where they once lived proposed a park renovation in their honor. A small garden would be planted with plaques bearing their names: Julia, Mark, Evan, Lila. Donations poured in from across the country. Strangers sent letters, poems, and drawings. Some had lost family. Others were simply moved by the tragedy. The church where Claire found the bear held a remembrance service. Dozens attended. The blue bear was not shown publicly, but was referenced as the object that changed everything. Children brought stuffed animals and placed them at the altar. Candles flickered beneath their feet. Claire stood and spoke briefly. She said she would never forget the feeling of holding that toy in her hands, never knowing what it carried. She said she still asked herself what might have happened if her dog had not torn the seam. That question would never leave her. But she also said she believed the Wallace family had found peace not in forgetting, but in being remembered. Her voice cracked. She returned to her seat in silence. The pastor nodded. The choir sang. The candles burned late into the evening. Meanwhile, authorities began re-examining other cold cases. Dozens of families contacted investigators wondering if their missing loved ones had crossed paths with Howard Lormer. Some remembered seeing a rust-colored truck. Others described being offered toys by a stranger in their neighborhood. Old reports were pulled from storage. Tips were rechecked. Analysts looked for patterns. They focused especially on cases between 2003 and 2008, the period Lormer had lived in Michigan. Several cases showed unsettling similarities. A child who disappeared near a laundromat. A family who vanished on their way to a summer rental. None had been tied together until now. Vickers worked with a small team to compare timelines and locations. While none could be definitively linked, the circumstantial patterns left little doubt. Lormer may have acted more than once. He may have studied his targets and waited until the conditions aligned. Vickers found himself reopening files long considered inactive. The weight of unfinished work loomed again, but this time families had hope. They had seen what could happen when a single clue was followed. They had watched as a toy bear led to a hidden room, and a hidden room led to the truth. They now had reason to believe their answers still existed. Vickers returned to Oak Hollow Drive for the first time since the trial ended. The Wallace house had new residents. Children played in the front yard. A red bicycle lay on its side near the mailbox. The flower bed Julia once tended was now filled with fresh tulips. Vickers parked across the street and sat for a long time. The street looked ordinary, quiet, safe. No signs remained of what had happened there, but in his mind every detail replayed. The unopened meal on the counter, the toys stacked near the garage, the unsent letter on Julia's desk. He thought of Lila's final drawing, the small heart, the word mom. He closed his eyes and let the image settle. Then he drove away. The case was closed. But the story would remain. It would live in court. Transcripts, news articles, and memory. It would live in the silence between breaths. And most of all, it would live in the small, everyday moments where loss is felt most clearly. A garage sale, a missing toy, a knock that never came. The Wallace family had been hidden for 16 years. Now finally they had been found. Months after the trial concluded, the snow began to fall across Michigan. Thin at first, then heavy, blanketing the neighborhoods where the Wallace family once lived and laughed and existed like any other. Claire Benton sat on her porch one evening, wrapped in a thick quilt, her hands resting on a warm cup of tea. She watched the snow land softly on her railing, the glow from her porch light giving the flakes a golden shimmer. Across from her yard, a young couple decorated a small pine tree with strings of white lights. Their child giggled as he tossed handfuls of snow into the air, spinning beneath the falling sky. Claire closed her eyes and took a slow breath. She thought of the little girl with a blue bear. She thought of the mother who hummed lullabies in a dark room. And she thought of a toy sewn shut with quiet violence. That image never left her. Not during the nights when the trial played in her head, or the afternoons when reporters asked her to speak again. She had said all she needed. Now she only watched and remembered. The snow continued to fall. Detective Vickers transferred to a quieter precinct after the trial ended. The Wallace case had worn on him in ways he had not anticipated. It was not just the imagery or the evidence. It was the weight of how long the truth had remained buried, how close it had always been, and how silence had hidden it so effectively. He had boxes of documents in his new office, files reopened, reports restudied. But most days he kept the Wallace file locked in a separate drawer. Not because it was finished, but because it had become a reminder. He knew that justice, when it finally came, rarely arrived with fanfare. It came quietly, through patience, through grief, through the stubborn refusal to let a single question go unanswered. Vickers often thought of Julia's final days. He thought of Evan's silence. He thought of Lila's drawings, and how a child found ways to speak when no one else could hear her. And above all, he thought of the long passage of time. 16 years was long enough for flowers to regrow in a yard, and for old wounds to scar over. But it was not long enough to forget. The Wallace house was sold again in the spring. The new owners planted a cherry tree in the front yard. It bloomed fast, soft white petals falling like paper rain. Neighbors said the children who lived there now were quiet and polite. Sometimes they played with toys near the garage. Sometimes they chased each other in the yard until their laughter echoed off the fences. One neighbor, a retired teacher, said she often thought of Julia Wallace when she walked past. Not because of anything visible, but because she had once spoken to her on the street years before and remembered her kindness. She said Julia had helped carry groceries when her arms were full. She said Mark had fixed a flat bicycle tire without being asked. Small things, things that remained. That was the part of the story that never made the papers. The quiet ways people exist in each other's lives. The simple gestures that are remembered long after names fade. She often left sunflowers at the edge of their former driveway. Not for a memorial, but for memory. She hoped they would grow each year, and each year they did. In a different town, a former church basement was turned into a community center. The local council named one corner the Lila room. Inside were shelves of donated toys and books. A sign on the wall read, "Every child matters." Children came there after school, some for warmth, some for comfort, some because they had nowhere else to go. No one asked questions. They only made space. A teacher donated a stack of notebooks and encouraged the children to draw. Some pictures were silly. Some were abstract. Some were memories held on paper. Every so often a drawing would appear that carried a quiet sadness. A house with no windows, a hand reaching for another. The volunteers never asked what it meant. They simply placed it on the wall. Because sometimes the story is not in what is said, but in what is shared. The Lila room became a place of quiet healing, a space where children could speak without words and adults could listen without judgment. It was not loud, it was not perfect, but it was a beginning. In the end, the story of the Wallace family did not end in a courtroom or in the silent halls of evidence lockers. It ended in small homes and quiet corners in community spaces and porch lights. It ended in the hearts of people who refused to forget who carried their names forward, not as a headline, but as a reminder of how fragile life can be and how deeply people are connected. The Blue Bear was never displayed again. It remained in a sealed box, preserved only for history. Its story had been told. Now other stories were beginning. Claire sometimes volunteered at the Lila room, helping children with crafts. She often paused at the door before entering, not to hesitate, but to reflect. She believed the past did not need to be buried. It needed to be acknowledged. It needed to be held gently, like a child's drawing, like a faded photograph, so that when new stories were written, they were written with care. The snow returned the next winter. Light at first, then heavy. The cherry tree stood bare, its branches waiting. The Wallace case no longer ran on the news. The world moved forward as it always did. But every so often a stranger would pause at the edge of Oak Hollow Drive and read the plaque beneath the cherry tree. It read, "For the family who vanished, and for those who would not let them stay hidden." The words were simple. They were enough. Because in the end, the true story was not just about what was found. It was about who chose to look. If you found this story moving or thought-provoking, make sure to like and subscribe for more mysteries based on real emotions and hidden truths. Let us know in the comments what you think about the plot and where in the world you are watching from. Your thoughts help us bring even more gripping stories to life.